Hello, I'm Thais Lopez-Bobo, co-founder and trustee of Bolo Foundation, and I serve on the EDF Action Board of Directors. I'm excited to be here today to introduce the session on misinformation. The word transparency and truth could not be better represented by a bipartisan organization. EDF strives to make a positive impact based on facts, which is the primary reason for my support. As a mother, I have always emphasized the importance of taking action to my children. This especially applies when it comes to protecting the future of our environment. We're proud to support EDF Action in their mission to inspire constituents to stand up by using their voices to drive legislators along with elected officials to take bold climate action. We each have a part to play in protecting our environment, and helping to fight misinformation is just one way you can get involved in advocating for change. There is an old saying that reads, "A lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth can get its boots on." This is absolutely true in the social media era. In fact, falsehoods are 70% more likely to be retweeted on Twitter than the truth. Furthermore, they reach their first 1,500 people 6 times faster. In our Bolo social platforms at Bolo Foundation, we aim to be very careful in only sharing truthful information and choosing science-based sources. But misinformation is out there and is currently a critical problem in social media and beyond. We take time to fact-check every detail. To us, it is important to make sure that information is relevant, factual, accurate, and useful. A good example is when Texas faced record low temperatures this February, leaving millions without electricity. Some people declared that the state was relying too much on renewable energy, but in reality, the wind power was expected to make up only a fraction of what the state had planned for during the winter. We immediately share more information to educate and share facts, explaining why froze wind turbines are not the main culprit for Texas power outages. Misinformation and disinformation are everywhere. But what is the difference? Disinformation is deliberately false or misleading information, while misinformation is unintentionally misleading information. Regardless of the intentions, misinformation spreads like wildfires on social platforms. It even seeps more in our mainstream news. No issue is off limit, including climate change, coronavirus, and elections. Today, we'll learn more about the harm it can cause to our society and what can we do to fight it. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Thais, for the great introduction. I'm Jack Pratt. I'm the Senior Political Director for EDF Action, and I'm excited to introduce you to Jessica Reese. She's the Senior Director at Pulpit Interactive, a communications firm that EDF Action has worked with closely over the years on projects ranging from climate awareness, digital campaigns, to our efforts currently underway to combat misinformation. Before I pass it over to Jessica, just a few housekeeping items. If you have a question at any point during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit your question, and we'll add it to the queue. If you experience any technical difficulties, please use the chat feature, and our team will be glad to help how we can. And now, over to you, Jessica.
Great. Thank you, Jack, so much. And I am delighted to be here to share some thoughts about how we approach disinformation and the strategies that help combat it and make it less damaging. My team's perspective on disinformation is really shaped by my experience as a pollster and the work our team has done with the Biden-Harris campaign, as well as with the Ad Council on vaccine disinformation, and now with climate disinformation. I come at disinformation a little bit differently, less from social listening and media monitoring perspective, but more straight from the mouths of voters. You know, as a pollster, traditionally disinformation would reach me when I heard people repeat it back to me in focus groups or when I saw evidence of it in survey data. And obviously that's a very big warning sign when people are repeating back untrue things or mistruths as they've seen or heard online. That insight led to our team's work with the Biden campaign to marry weekly survey research to disinformation tracking and focus groups among people who had seen or heard different disinformation narratives. And it really helped us bring to life a dimension of disinformation that a lot of tracking misses. That is, what people actually understand and what they make of what they read online. And really and it really forced us to design counter strategies and paid media programs to address how disinformation really works in the minds of voters and how we're able to combat it. So now, few organizations have the ability to work on the same scale as a very large presidential campaign. We've also been able to use this type of framework with other entities. I mentioned the Ad Council on Vaccine Disinformation. So in the next few minutes I have with you today, I want to review some of the lessons that we've learned from these two experiences, and then how we brought them to climate disinformation and misinformation in particular. And then I want to talk about some of the diagnostic work we've done with EDF Action and the paid media strategy it has helped inform. Let me start with our view about disinformation. In our experience, disinformation is a demand side problem. That is, it takes root where there are already pre-existing doubts or negative narratives that individuals already have. And while disinformation may be death by 1,000 cuts, these cuts are not all created equal. There are certain narratives that different stories ladder up to. And if individuals already believe these narratives, the disinformation is more damaging and more harmful. Now, we can't chase each individual story, but what we can do is make it less powerful and reduce the demand for these types of negative stories. And also, because disinformation tends to be self-reinforcing and self-seeking, we can use what we know to predict what kinds of different stories are most harmful and what might potentially take off and require a rapid response. Now, climate disinformation in particular is different and dangerous. It predates social media. There have been critical and untrue voices working against climate action since before the first Earth Day. In that sense, we are working against generations of disinformation that have been told over time and that have really gotten into voters' minds. And that's different from disinformation around an individual candidate or even around a particular vaccine. Yet there are still very important lessons from the campaign and from vaccine disinformation that we are building on. And let me review a few of them here to share how we think through these things. First, it's critical to measure the harm an attack causes, not just the volume of traffic that it creates on social media. During the Biden campaign, if we had just been watching social, we would have thought the biggest threat came from these stories, especially in the fall, late September, early October, about Hunter Biden and Ukraine and his laptop and Burisma. These stories dwarfed all other social conversation and all other postings when we were looking online to what was generating traffic and attention. But week over week, we consistently saw that the stories that were most damaging to candidate Biden were the stories that perpetuated rumors about the vice president's age and mental capacity. I think you probably know the types of stories that I'm talking about. And that leads to the second lesson of disinformation, is that we need to focus on the voters who matter. Part of the reason Hunter Biden was spiking on social was because a lot of far-right groups were sharing these stories. And even there were far groups on the left who were sharing it because of the broader context of the Trump impeachment and Trump's phone call with Ukraine and calling out that Trump really was scraping for this information. But it never really cracked the surface among the voters who we cared about. Persuadable voters who at the time we were defining as undecided voters, or those who could still change their mind. Of which there were not a ton in September and October. Yet their biggest concern consistently was the vice president's cognitive and mental abilities. And that's where we really had to keep our focus. And that leads to the third lesson that we learned here, is that all of this comes together and allows us to prioritize a response to different disinformation stories. Obviously, this graph here is a simplified version of what we were seeing with our different tracking throughout the campaign. But here we're charting awareness of different disinformation narratives up and down, and then the danger, or we ask voters directly if it causes harm or causes doubts about Joe Biden at the time. The different stories that are in the top right quadrant, these are stories that there's high awareness and high danger. These are the ones that require a direct response. You can see the Hunter Biden story on the other side, just about the same or just a little lower in terms of awareness, but didn't cause as much harm for voters. Those claims of corruption just weren't believable to people and thus caused less harm. And then, the lower left-hand quadrant, where we're saying low awareness, low danger, these were the type of QAnon stories we were seeing that not a lot of persuadable voters were aware of. Now, of course, QAnon narratives, if they can metastasize into a real-world event, such as we saw in January, obviously, are dangerous. But in terms of how voters are making up their minds, and I think especially as we transition to talk about climate, as people are making up their minds, it's really important to focus on, that high awareness, high danger type of narratives as people are making a decision about something, whether it's to vote for someone or to take action on different types of climate action. This type of graphical representation helps us sort our priorities and prioritize, but it also helps us see how different narratives are related to one another. And that brings us to the fourth lesson that we learned, which is taking note of the patterns that different disinformation stories create. What at first seems like a collection of disparate stories about Biden in the basement, about lawless cities, about Biden and the earpiece of the debate, about Antifa claims, all these different individual stories. What happens is they actually come together and form one story in the mind of persuadable voters, in this case about Joe Biden, that Joe Biden is too weak to stand up to the more radical voices in his party. And that was really the wound that all these different disinformation attacks created, a larger wound that Joe Biden doesn't have the cognitive ability to stand up to the more radical elements of his party. So the way we wanted to counter this was to make it less powerful and to show candidate Biden as a strong leader, driven by his middle-class values, and who would really be the author of his own presidency. And tactically, we did this in a few different ways, which is the fifth piece of what we learned is how to drive these counter narratives. By one lesson we saw is, through our polling and testing is that the campaign started early on with, very beautiful, very slickly produced commercials. They seemed almost more like movie trailers than political commercials. We found, with these doubts about candidate Biden and his strength and abilities, voters really wanted to see him, direct to camera, unedited, unfiltered. So there was a shift toward the end of the campaign where we showed him more direct to camera. We used more clips of him at the debates, especially when he spoke directly to the American people. And that was a shift because we wanted to show, Biden showing his own strength. Second, we really focused toward the end on Scranton values, on middle-class values, as a direct contrast to kind of the radical elements that we were worried that were shaping the vice president's candidacy. And then finally, we looked for and highlighted what we call unexpected messengers or unexpected validators that would really break people outside of their expected media bubbles. We found a few Fox News stories that we paid to promote and did a lot of work for us. And it's not so much that we were trying to reach Fox News viewers or readers, although that was a small piece of it, but it was more critical because when voters come across a positive story about Joe Biden from Fox News, it surprises them a little bit and they pay a little bit more attention in a way that they wouldn't even reading the same story from the New York Times or another source they have a preconception about. So really looking for those unexpected sources and validators as we're trying to tell a story about candidate Biden here. So what does this all mean for climate disinformation? I think we really wanted to bring these lessons through and make sure that we are learning what we saw on a large scale with the campaign and use these same lessons for climate. First, an important note, and I think many of you know this, and as Thais said in her introduction, climate disinformation, it's a little bit different. It's not just bots and trolls. It's a larger policy ecosystem, and it's being spread not just by bad actors or Russian agents, but it's being spread by the mainstream media sources, by elected officials. So here, the answer for misinformation, it's not about working the refs and getting pages shut down or taken down or bad actors taken off or deplatformed. There really is a larger issue that requires a broader strategy that isn't just take things down as they come, as different stories come up. And I think because of that makes our understanding and framework even more important. In the same way that we approached with Biden, I think we can bring that at a similar way to climate. First, we need to measure the harm an attack causes, not just the volume on social. We did that earlier this year by conducting a poll in battleground states in March of this year that was meant to track and give us real numbers of awareness and harm across a host of different disinformation and misinformation narratives about climate. Second, we want to focus on the individuals who matter. For Biden, that was undecided voters. For vaccine work, it's the vaccine hesitant. For climate action, we are looking at less partisan voters, so limiting, we're cutting out the partisan ends, and we're looking at people who who see climate change is real, but maybe think the government is already doing enough, or that it's not the government's role. So we're really focusing on that share of voters. We can call them persuadable on climate action, the ones who really matter as we're trying to mount campaigns and drive action. Third, we need to prioritize our response, and I'll show you how we come to that. Fourth, treating the wound that these different climate disinformations cause and not the attack. And then finally, pushing for unexpected sources of response. So I want to go through and show you how we got to these things and what this says for us for climate. So as I mentioned, we started with a poll, and we pulled out some of the more common attacks that we were seeing on social media, ranging from very pure disinformation to some that feel more like misinformation. And we measured the relative harm of 4 different kinds of attacks, categorized by ones that have to do with the economy and jobs. So things that the Biden administration will make fracking illegal. That's a transition from oil and gas will eliminate millions of jobs. The energy from solar will raise, from renewable sources will raise energy bills, and that under the Green New Deal, gas prices would rise to over $13 a gallon. We looked at some of the more conspiratorial stories that are out there, such as claims that climate activists want everyone to stop eating meat. I'll come to that. That climate policies in the Green New Deal want to cut carbon by eliminating cars and planes. And even just the claim that global warming isn't real because some places have low temperatures. We looked at stories around efficacy of renewable energy as well as safety. Stories that like electric vehicles are worse for the planet than gas vehicles because of the mining and the power sources they require, that wind turbines cause cancer. And then we looked at some of the reliability narratives that, calling into question the reliability of solar, and even the more recent example of the Texas blackouts caused by a failure of wind power. We took these different narratives and we asked them across 2 different dimensions. 1, awareness. Have people seen or heard anything about these stories? And then 2, believability. Do they believe them to be true? And from that, we generated a harm index. That is the share of independent voters who have seen these stories and believe them to be true. And here a real pattern emerges that the stories that cause the most harm are those that highlight the potential disruption that climate action would bring. And it's not just overall disruption, it's very specific types of disruption. Disruption to how we generate our power, disruption to how our economy is structured, and even disruption to the food that we eat. And those are the narratives that really can take on the most harm. And when we plot this graphically, recognize this from the work we did, or what I showed earlier, you can see that the upper right-hand quadrant, again, those high awareness, high danger stories, are those stories about that the transition away from oil and gas will eliminate millions of jobs, that the Biden administration would eliminate fracking. These are the stories that require the most active response from our side. If you look to the other side of this graph, we see that stories that have almost as high awareness, but just don't cause as much harm in the minds of independent voters. The fact that, or the claim that global warming is not real, that, Texas blackouts are caused by wind failure, that solar is not long-term. It's not that voters aren't hearing these stories, it's that they're just less damaging about their views toward climate action. Lastly, on this graph, the lower right-hand quadrant, places where there are stories in which there is lower awareness but still high danger. We are very focused here, and I will tell you quite frankly that in March when we ran this poll, I was a bit surprised that claims that climate activists want to make everyone stop eating meat was as dangerous as it is, and was causing harm. I will tell you now, the conversation over the past few weeks about climate activists or Biden taking away your 4th of July hamburger really resonate with me and show that this is actually quite a damaging story. And I think a lot of people want to laugh it off as, oh, it's, obviously climate action doesn't want to stop people from eating hamburgers, but the fact that it fits into that narrative about disruption is really why it embeds itself in voters' minds. And I wonder and I worry that if we were to run this poll again, now that has been in the news and been shared on not only on social media but on Fox News and other places, that blue dot of stopping eating meat moves up into kind of a place that requires more of a response because it is crossed into higher levels of awareness. But overall, the way that I see this and the way that we bring this together is, we have these different attacks. We have attacks that climate change policies will hurt our economy, that climate change policies are, conspiratorial and motivated by something else, that they're not safe or effective, that climate change policies will make us vulnerable and we can't rely on power. These individual attacks are all creating a larger wound. And it's making voters who are persuadable on climate action, it's making them believe that efforts to address climate change will disrupt my life in ways that are unacceptable, and that the risk of climate change isn't large enough to be worth a change. And to disrupt this, what we need to do is tell a different story and really and really tell a story that climate change isn't scary and disruptive, but rather it brings new opportunities for job growth and for the US to be a leader in the global economy, and that the risk of climate change is real and is already here. In our poll as well, we tested different responses and found that by far it is more effective to talk about the opportunities that climate brings rather than trying to have a scientific discussion or relitigate or tell people that their beliefs are wrong. It's better to instead just tell the positive story about the opportunity that new jobs and new opportunities in climate happen. So that is what we are doing with a current paid media program with EDF Action, and we were really trying to show voters the opportunity, and we're working to bring this to life. One, we are targeting independent voters in battleground states. We are serving them with different paid media that includes an ad that literally scrolls all the types of good paying jobs that climate action will give us: laborers, welders, accountants, trainers. We are looking for news stories to promote that show the opportunity for perhaps those in fossil fuel communities and helping them transition to a clean energy future. We are searching for those unexpected validators, whether it's United Mine Workers coming out in support of transition to clean energy. And again, we're really trying to create videos and content and stories that surprise people a little bit and push people off of their expectations. For example, this video here, we purposefully didn't use the color green. We don't want it to look like it's coming from a climate group. We purposely sought out a voiceover actor who has a gravelly voice and sounds like he should be doing a Chevy truck ad. We're really looking for ways to be unexpected for these voters who are still making up their minds on climate action. And so we are, in the field of this paid media program with EDF Action. We're eager to kind of report back once we can, the impact. Because again, we feel really confident about this way to approach disinformation. The best way is to counter it. To counter it is to make it less powerful in the minds of voters. Our job isn't to chase or to amplify, but rather it's to reduce the demand for disinformation. And I'm really excited to talk about that with you all and with questions and with our panelists here. And I'm very eager to continue this conversation with the larger group here.
All right, thanks so much, Jessica. So just briefly, my name is Erin McElweeney. I am a senior research analyst with Graphica, and I'm going to help us sort of take a deeper dive into what all of Jessica's findings mean with Jessica and some of our other panelists. First off, that was a fantastic presentation. I think combining survey data with this disinformation tracking to see what the offline impacts really are is so valuable. I'm going to take moderator's privilege here and ask you a quick follow-up question, Jessica, before the Q&A. I'm curious, we know that mis and disinformation can target and impact different communities disproportionately, specifically marginalized communities. And, I'm wondering how you and your team, when you're doing this work of assessing the harms and urgency of mis and disinformation, how that factors into your work.
That's a really great question, and something that is certainly true. That the way that disinformation works in different communities is really important, and it's really important not to paint all voters with a broad brush and say this narrative always works like this in everyone's mind. I think there are two different pieces of evidence of that. I think just one, it's attitudinal. Like, again, because so much of this is based on people's pre-existing beliefs. When people have an existing belief, whether it's political or otherwise, that makes them susceptible for certain disinformation. I think one example that's very easy to think of, and one that kept us up at night a lot, as you know, a lot of in various Hispanic communities, especially Cuban, Venezuelan, Nicaraguan communities that have different attitudinal markers based on where they're coming from and historical and cultural ties. They were much more susceptible to those calls about socialism, and that was something that we were very aware of, and we, to be very honest, we struggled to deal with. But again, because those narratives, those pre-existing narratives were so deep, and it makes a lot of good sense that, if you grew up in Venezuela, 10 or 15 years ago, of course you have a negative image of socialism, or if you're not Chavista, of course you have a negative image of socialism and what it has done to the country. And that is tied to like the broader left. And that narrative tie is very easy to make to connect, then candidate, now President Biden. So I think you're certainly right that different communities often hear and interpret different disinformation differently. And I think that speaks to having different, not only validators, but just overall strategies to talk to different groups. I think some of the best Hispanic outreach we saw, came not from anything that the campaign was doing, but from, community leaders and people that people trust. And really, disinformation comes down to trust a lot too, and building trust and not leaving people susceptible to that kind of disinformation.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, I agree. I think disinformation existed before the internet, and taking into account all of those different social and historical implications that get wrapped up into disinformation is so important. And I think our panelists will have a lot to say on this topic as well. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce them. We have Christina Lopez-G. She's a senior research analyst with Data and Society. And we also have Bridget Todd, who is the director of communications at We Are Ultraviolet and the creator and host of the fantastic podcast, There Are No Girls on the Internet. So we have a lot to cover and not a lot of time, so I'm just going to jump right in. First question is for you, Bridget. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you got into this line of work?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really got interested seriously about mis and disinformation from the good old family group chat with all my cousins and my uncles and my aunties. When COVID started, we were using a WhatsApp group chat a lot more frequently to stay in touch. And that was when I really started to see the way that disinformation and like false stories could really take hold of folks in my own community. And so I remember a cousin of mine putting in a link to an article about how the reason you were seeing all of these COVID vaccine initiatives and talk about COVID vaccine initiatives in like Black and brown communities was because the vaccine was being tested on Black people. And obviously we know that's not true, but that was really when I started to think, oh, wow, dis and misinformation is really taking hold of people in my life, and it's impacting the way they think about their health, the way they think about voting, the way that can really shape their behavior. And so I started my podcast because I wanted to find a way to really talk about mis and disinformation, but in a way that's accessible. I am not a researcher. I don't have a background in research, but I still know how to take apart an incorrect story when I see one. I know how to take apart mis and disinformation. And so for me, it really came from just trying to find ways to talk to my own community about how dangerous dis and misinformation can be and how we can recognize it.
Amazing. I love those origin stories when you hear the first piece of misinformation from a relative or friend, and it really sinks in like, yep, this is all around me. So just to follow up on this question of how dangerous mis and disinformation can really be, could you talk through, in your experience, what are some of the most corrosive disinformation practices that you've seen?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say it's exactly what some of the things that Jessica alluded to in her presentation just now. Mis and disinformation that really is grounded in people's pre-existing narratives. I would say in communities of color, some of the most corrosive disinformation I've seen is disinformation that is rooted in tension between communities of color. So, over the last summer, we saw all of these racial justice reckonings and uprisings, dis and misinformation that was clearly meant to drive wedges between Latinos and Black folks or other communities of color. Everybody knows that our communities are stronger when we come together, yet disinformers and bad actors would like us to believe that that is not the case. And so it was really interesting and sort of kind of scary to see how savvy these bad actors were at really finding these already existing tension points between our communities and inflaming them. So I think that disinformation that really speaks to that. I would also say disinformation that can spread in non-English communities because, disinformers, again, they're very savvy. They know a lot of these communities are being underserved. We don't have enough Spanish language news and media outlets. And so they know like, we can, identify these places where there is gaps in, timely, trusted, accurate information and fill that gap with bad information. And so I would really say the most corrosive disinformation and misinformation I have seen are the really savvy ways that it really does target underrepresented communities and communities of color.
Yes, absolutely. And Christina, I know your work overlaps with a lot of what Bridget was just describing, especially getting into those different sort of voids of information and how those can be exploited and manipulated. And I would love to hear your thoughts a bit further on how these different tactics have evolved in the last few years in your experience.
Thank you so much. I think this is a crucial question, especially specifically when we're trying to figure out how to stop these tactics. And I think the first thing to know about them is that they all adapt really well to what is allowed by a platform, whether that's through the sign or whether that's in the platform's moderation and content policies. It really is to disinformers what they can get away with. So, I believe that in the first few years that we were trying to understand large-scale disinformation, there was this impulse to explain away the technological landscape that we were facing. And there was an understandable overfocus on tech-based, like complicated tactics like, massive botnets or AI creating websites that mirror credible websites. And there was a lot of focus on this really complicated kind of hacker-friendly tactics, when in reality, a lot of what's underneath the tip of the iceberg and what's really wreaking havoc out there are these very DIY methods of building narratives. And one way that I've seen something evolved, I think, over the past few years, and one thing that I think was one of the building blocks for the large scale, the election was stolen lie, was this tactic that used a lot of real vetted information, like real reporting, and put it together and decontextualized it. And it was kind of using real dots, but connecting the dots in a way that reached to the wrong conclusion. And so this type of concocting really complex narratives using real or different content that was actually truthful was really complicated, because the contextualizing and the framing was added by influencers. And as you know, Jessica also mentioned this, but trust is so important in making this information stick. And the parasocial relationships that these influencers are able to form with their audiences and the communities that they build add this veneer of trust to any information that makes it really easy to stick. One of my colleagues really brilliantly mentioned this tactic and called it a mosaic, kind of, because just like the works of art that are done using different tiles and then you back away and see this big picture, very similarly, this misleading narratives are concocted by real pieces of evidence that are put together to lead you in the wrong conclusion. And it's especially hard because it challenges every platform's moderation policies, which tend to concern themselves with the binary of is this true or this not true. And then because they only look at individual pieces of content, you miss the big picture lies that they take time, they take community, and they take huge amounts of amplification, both by mainstream media or legitimate actors to gain that legitimacy. And then just by the sheer size of them, they become much harder to unbelieve.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was a fantastic explanation. I really do think when you're describing this mosaic, I think of the work at Graphica too. And we see, when we're looking at these bigger picture of the networks that are spreading this type of mis and disinformation, you start to see this completely different alternative network of information sources and influencers and content. So it's not just about picking out individual pieces of content and debunking those. It really is this entire alternative ecosystem that's been created and maintained by these different influencers and actors. And I think that's such a good and important point to be thinking about. And, also on the, I think it's a really interesting point of how, of different sort of bad actors seeing what they can get away with and push the boundaries with, because in 2020, we really saw for the first time, major platforms grapple with policies that were content-based. It wasn't just the behavior. It wasn't, this is a identified botnet, these are identified fake accounts. It's easy to sort of have that binary and take those down. But we saw, platforms try to draw that line and distinguish that line between how much hesitancy and skepticism or misinformation can be allowed on platforms. And I think that works in tandem with these actors trying to see how far they can push and spread different narratives. So, my next question quickly is sort of the big question of how do we fix the internet? And Christina, if you don't mind just talking through, what can mainstream media do about this? What can big tech, what can legislators really do to at least take a couple positive steps forward in the right direction of fixing this?
I think everyone has sort of hinted at this a little bit, in that disinformation at the end of the day is a complex problem because of its complex nature. It takes a village, and the fact that you have, it's a network problem. So you have the participation of mainstream media, you have platforms, and you have, some of the fixes that could do a lot of improvement would be the figuring out how to make algorithms, recommendation algorithms that play a huge role in deciding what is that people see, or what pieces of content gain engagement. And basically they do the role of putting a piece of content that wouldn't have reached very, very far. They give it incredible amplification and speed. So if we could figure out ways that allow for human moderation before things go virally out of control, if we could figure out a way to add some friction to the activity of sharing so quickly and kind of make this information a little slower, we could get some traction inside of social media platforms to do that. That would be great. But because that is really hard to do, we have to be looking at other types of solutions as well. And as you know, everyone plays a part. And I tend to shy away from solutions that only center, what everyone has available to them. I think it's more important for bigger actors like mainstream media to really understand the role that they're playing in the ecosystem, in the informational landscape in general, and understand the ways that they are conduct of bad information, in which they legitimize information and give disinformers a great advantage by amplifying and putting narratives in front of people unsuspecting eyes. And I think for once, that would be really important. And then there is also the responsibility of our elected officials, and they also play a role in amplifying, and they also play a role in legitimizing information that is not true. And so seeing this as a problem that is complex because it requires a giant network also leads you to think about solutions that involve all of the network and that, can maybe chip away at the problem, but it is a large scale problem that we can't just fix with algorithmic design changes, or we definitely need legislation as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Christina. I know that's never an easy question. It is incredibly complicated and will take a lot of trial and error too. It's not going to be a single fix. So really appreciate that thoughtful answer. So we're not done with the conversation with Bridget and Christina. I'm going to bring in Jessica back and her colleague, Alex Kellner. They're going to join us now to answer some audience Q&A questions. And this is also just a reminder that if you have a question, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit it. All right, our first question is, so many campaigns employ relational organizing tactics to reach would-be voters from a trusted source. Is it true that disinformation is more dangerous when someone is more likely to share it with family and friends? And what makes a mistruth more shareable? Jessica, I think you probably were the reason that this question was asked during your fantastic presentation. So if you want to take it first, and we can pass it off to other panelists as well.
I'll start, but it's almost exactly what Bridget, how she opened her comments. Like, she sees stuff in her family text, and I think it's true. And when we talk to people about what they trust, trust is a hard thing to measure, and it's very hard to ask someone, do you trust X or Y or Z? But we know, just like from how people work, that if you hear something, from a family member, from a friend, from someone in real life, it is more trusted. And I think I'm glad that the question mentioned relational organizing, because that is one way that campaigns are working to develop trust. And I think maybe the other way than the question actually asked. But one kind of grassroots or a theory that a lot of campaigns are employing and are hiring people to do this directly is to not just talk to people who they don't know, but really work their own networks and talk to their own friends and family. And smart campaigns are finding people who are really involved in their communities and are working with them to talk with people. So maybe smart campaigns are working with small businesses who are in their community and have lots of followers on Facebook, or working with other individuals, whether it's troop leaders or people who volunteer at schools. Those are great people for campaigns to bring in and have them not just parrot back their own talking points, but really build trust with different people so that they're less susceptible to some things. And I think, exactly as the question said, the flip side of that is, if there is someone in your friend or family network who has these disinformation stories and shares them, it is more powerful and it is more worrisome if you get something from a friend or family when you are susceptible. I think a lot of us probably have stories about grandmas or uncles sending us emails that we laugh at, but there are plenty of people who are still making up their minds on issues, and when a friend or family member shares something, they pay attention. So I think I'll see what others think, but I think the other thing to know is that you and we all are friends and family of our larger groups. So it's important to be good actors when we share information and post things online as well.
Yeah, I would love to add to that. In the work that I do, I have seen time and time again that it is the trusted auntie or the trusted oldest daughter that really plays the role of the trusted sort of person in the family that everybody goes to for their information. So whether it's information about the COVID vaccine, whether it's information about how they can vote, what they need to vote, there's usually somebody in the family that is the trusted spokesperson that everyone knows they can get information from. So I think really, whether it's a family or a community, identifying who those people are that people in different communities trust. I know in the Black community, it is the person who does my hair. We spend 3 hours together every month. I trust what she has to say. And so I think it really is about exactly what you said, not expecting people to just parrot back talking points, but really trust people who are trusted members of different communities, different groups, to be good disseminators of good information that's really going to help their communities.
And in terms of what makes something a mistruth more shareable via these channels, which I completely agree that trusted source is maybe more powerful than anything we can do. But in terms of what makes it more shareable is something that they already believe to be true, or from a trusted source on other matters. And so, if they believe a news anchor that they already trust said something that is untrue, they're more likely to share that information, which is why it's just critically important for us to try to inoculate against people believing the underlying mistruth in the first place, or being open to that, so that it doesn't have a chance to take off or be shared in the first place. Really, that's so much of this comes down to nipping this at the bud before things start, as opposed to once they've already started.
All right, thank you all. I think it is so important to talk about that sort of on the groundwork. We often get caught up in conversations about how we can fix things on the internet without acknowledging that sort of real world on the groundwork that we can be doing. So the next question comes from Jeffrey Williams. This is specifically for Jessica and Alex. Jeffrey wonders, what are the harm indices measuring that you had shown in your presentation? And then how do you measure how much harm disinformation can cause? And how do you determine a message's placement on the awareness and harm chart?
Great question. And Jeffrey, I appreciate I know that everyone here likes data and numbers, so I appreciate the opportunity to talk about data and numbers with a friendly audience. The harm index is, we look among a share of voters. In this case, for climate, we were looking among independent voters. And it is the share of independent voters who, one, have seen that narrative and then also believe it to be true. So some of those narratives were, pushing close to 50%, which should be pretty alarming in terms of how independent voters are, not only seeing information, but how they interpret it to be true or not. And the three that we highlighted, that the Biden administration would eliminate fracking, that the move away from fossil fuels would lose jobs, and then the meat story as well, are all one of those that, over 40% of independent voters have both heard and believe to be true. So that's what that means. And then when we place on our scale, like how to consider, we just plot those 2 points relative to one another. So one axis was awareness, one is the level of harm. And for harm, that is, those who say it raises doubts and believe it to be true. So we take voters at their word when we ask them if they've seen or heard things and if they believe them to be true. But I think, that is, by being a pollster, one of the downsides is we have to take voters at their word and what they tell us is true or not. So it's a framework, and it's measuring something that it's it's an index. So we've created it, but it is something that helps us in terms of organizing both, how do we prioritize a response, and then two, what does that response need to be? It's a helpful index to address and help think through those different stories.
All right, thanks so much, Jessica. We have another question for you that I'll ask, and then I'll probably sprinkle in some of my own because I also have questions, and I think it's something that everyone else would be interested in speaking to. But for you, Jessica, can you unpack why banning fracking is so potent? And why do voters think that would be disruptive to their lives? And do they interpret that as raising their energy costs?
That is a great question. So I'll tell you what I think. One thing we haven't done is, I mentioned that, for the Biden campaign, we did focus groups where we talked to voters who had seen different disinformation. And, we talked with Hispanic voters who had seen things about socialism. We talked with, voters who had seen things about, that creepy Joe by like all that. We heard people, directly what they saw, why they believed it. We haven't done that on climate, but I suspect that the reason why fracking is so potent is for two reasons. One, again, like it's a question of disruption. And I think over the past, decade, 15 years, fracking and natural gas have become such a big part of our energy landscape and have really moved, the country to not rely on foreign fuels, and has, given, some pride in terms of, American energy. I think that's part of it. I don't think it's the biggest part. I think the bigger part is that I think in communities where fracking is very important and where fracking supports a lot of jobs, be it in Appalachia or in Wyoming and in the West, it is fracking is part of the cultural landscape. And I think that, again, like a disruption, like a cultural disruption, whether it's taking away my 4th of July hamburger or types of jobs my family has always had, that is more damaging, and I think is a bigger issue than just price. But I think part of that question is price. I think one of the things over the past, again, decade, 15 years, natural gas is a less costly alternative in many cases to energy. So it is related to, cost, but I think it's really the disruption of, types of jobs, the types of jobs. So I think the way to talk about it, and one thing I didn't have time to get into that is a big piece of what we're doing, is not only talking about the opportunity for jobs in the US, but also the opportunity for the United States to be a world leader on these clean energy jobs. I think that fills a gap or at least a tension that a lot of these voters have about, lamenting the U.S.'s place on the world stage. And I think the opportunity that climate brings to talk about being a leader, to really play up, USA #1 on climate and clean energy jobs, is a big opportunity, and one that can help, especially with some of the communities that we're really looking at, more conservative communities, is important. I think, fracking takes that away a little bit, but showing the opportunity that it gives, I think, is a way to kind of address those concerns and doubts about fracking.
Great. So my next question does get in a little bit to these points that you're getting at, Jessica. The fact that climate misinformation has existed for a long time before the internet. We also know extremism, racism, disinformation, misinformation all existed before the internet. And so I would like to hear your all opinions on what makes the internet era different.
I'm gonna start with this one. I think that the biggest difference is the algorithmic recommendation, which that's true that this is not new problems. These have existed, and something that I think I want to rescue here is Bridget's point that what makes some disinformation really sticky and really corrosive is that it exploits folks' previously held views, right? And so it latches onto that. But the way that the internet has compounded on this is by finding who are going to be those other people that share those preconceived views and forming a community with them. And now they're all together in a community. And then you also have the capacity of making information not just reach way further than your natural audience at a given time, but also to do it in such spectacularly fast fashion that it takes away anyone's ability to really process, find other sources, think about, in the spur of the moment, whether you should share this or not. And because all of these are, communities build on parasocial relationships, sometimes through an influencer that you automatically already trust, you feel really safe. And so that makes the sharing go along really smoothly. And without the power that algorithms have given, this, content to reach further than it would naturally, I think that these very old problems have taken a much more complex nature now.
Yeah, and I would love to just add on to that really quickly, which is that idea about feeling safe. So many times when I see viral disinformation, misinformation, they're on these closed Facebook groups that are not necessarily political, not necessarily places where you're kind of primed for seeing politically or racially charged content. For instance, like a yoga, I'm a big yoga person. So like a lot of the yoga groups I'm in, you like a bunch of the just like average humdrum memes about yoga. Next thing you know, the next thing you see is something that is not necessarily about yoga. It's QAnon conspiracy theory or something that's really dangerous. And so I think exactly a lot of bad actors know that if they put these memes and this content in places where folks are feeling safe, it can really get people who have their guard down. I see that quite a bit. And I also think that thing that you just talked about recommendation, Facebook's own internal reporting says that the majority of times if somebody joins an extremist group, it's because their algorithm recommended that group to them. And so I think really folks really taking advantage of the community and parasocial aspects of the experience of being on the internet and being on social media. The thing that makes the internet so great, community building, can also be really dangerous when used to spread harm.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add on top of this is the internet provides a lot more opportunities for content creation and learning. So it's a force multiplier beyond that. So before, where maybe the trial and error was which pamphlet got noticed by people, or which conversation topic in a small individualized setting was carrying weight with people. Now you can post 20 different things to 20 different channels, see what takes off, and go from there. It gives, just as it gives us good actors lots of opportunities to do good in the world, it gives bad actors equal opportunity to learn from what works best and iterate from there.
Yes, thank you all so much. I agree, and I would also just add that I think there is an element of, this is something we're seeing in the climate mis and disinformation research that we're doing, is that there is an element of giving an appearance of an outsized presence and in being more mainstream than these ideas and content really are. And so it allows for either a far-right YouTuber or a climate denialist to interject their ideas and present them as a counterbalance rather than this like totally fringe debunked idea. And for people coming at it without knowledge or experience in those areas, it can really start to look at like a legitimate ideology or piece of content. So we have another question that came in from Lauren. Lauren says, it seems like people really gravitate to and weight negative, fearful information over positive stories. How do we flip the script and get more positive stories and good news on the internet and in the media? to make change less scary, and there's a rule of thumb, like, do you need 2 times or 10 times the positive to outweigh a negative story? And I know we only have a few minutes left. I think we can turn this one into a positive note to end on. And yeah, I'll pass it off to whoever wants to take it first. Or I can call on someone if someone has, Jessica, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Sure. So to think about this in a different way, everybody hates like negative political ads, but there's a reason why campaigns keep running negative political ads, because like the negative is persuasive and it does stick in people's minds, and fear is a very potent emotion, and you know that is just part of human nature. So I think the question hits the nail right on the head. Like, what do we like? If our counter strategy is to like share a positive vision and have a counter narrative that's different, like obviously there's a question about volume and about like how much you need to do that to actually have it break through and to have it be a strong enough shield against these negative attacks. I think part of it is that a lot of information on the internet, it's not necessarily a boxing match, it's more of a race. So it's not like I hit and then you hit and it's positive and negative. It's more of a race to define and who's able to define what voters think in the first place, rather than just going back and forth, but a race to get out ahead and have that positive vision. So I think I don't have a magic number of 2 to 1, 10 to 1 of what positive and negative needs to be, but I do know that for positive to work, we have to try to be out there before before a negative story is able to really seep in and color how voters see certain issues, especially climate action. Now, in something like climate action, as we've been saying, is generational and has been around for a very long time. That's obviously very, very difficult. I think there are good ways, and we talk a lot about how things being unexpected. We've had a lot of success on other issues and on other political ads. Kind of taking the more cheery aspects of the internet and using them to reach voters. Our firm last cycle, we made some cute like cat video ads, which were like, they were cat videos, but we used them to like tell a message and a story and kind of take like what people like about the internet, which is, cat videos and baby pictures and like the stuff that we actually like Facebook for. And, using that to kind of convey a message. And, yes, it was a political message, but we had cat videos in it. And so it was a little bit unexpected. And we were hoping people would listen to it. So I don't know if others have thoughts on positive versus negative.
I think I was just a little scared of ending in the note that we don't know what that number or rule of thumb would be, mostly because the way that content gets incentivized and, creators adapt the way that they create content precisely to talk to these amplification algorithms and precisely to be able to figure out what is the right combination that will keep people engaged. And from research, we know that emotions, positive or negative, keep people engaged. And one of the emotions that drives a lot of content is outrage. And so you could, use that, and content creators do use that to their advantage. And so the issue is where are you going to put that outrage or that or those emotions, and how are content creators going to see what they can get away with? And the algorithms, as algorithms get tweaked, also content strategies get tweaked as well. So it's hard to think about this in terms of, okay, this is the number of positive content we need to outweigh however number of negative content we need, because it will be different for everyone. And it will be different for what people tend to always click on, and algorithms are very responsive to people's behaviors. And so it really is hard to think about it because we don't have a model of the average user of the internet, because it changes so much.
All right, thank you, Christina. Bridget, did you have one last thought before I wrap things up?
I would say, I agree with all of that. I would say this is also where kind of thinking of yourself as a good steward of the internet comes in, just being really mindful of what it is you consume, what it is you engage with, because as Christina just said, like that's what we get surfaced up by these algorithms. And so if you spend a lot of your time engaging with content that is negative instead of positive, really taking the time to sort of do a little bit of internal question asking about that. Yes, platforms and legislators should be playing a bigger role in how we think about making a better internet, but we can all also be just good stewards of the internet as well. And so if that means thinking about it when we engage with negative behavior or negative content versus positive content, that's what we should be doing.
And the last thing I would add really quickly is, unfortunately, algorithms are going to continue to reward negative or fear-driven content because it is what people react to. And it's why EDF and other actors unfortunately have to use the pay-to-play nature of those algorithms to run paid media to change that conversation. Because the best positive content will still likely get run over by negative content, just by the very nature, by human nature, frankly. But we can overcome that by giving money to those platforms to make sure our content shows up first. I know it's a little bit of a down note to end on, but it is the reality of the situation.
Thank you all so much. So everyone do your part, share more cat videos. Biggest lesson of the day. No, this was great. It was such a pleasure talking to you all, hearing you all in discussion. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you're leaving the session with armed with new knowledge on misinformation and disinformation, and with some tools that you can utilize on how to combat it. If you have a question that didn't get answered during today's live event, please email events@edf.org and we'll make sure to follow up with you. And make sure to join again tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for the second and final session of EDF Action's Political Science Symposium, Strengthening the Democratic Process to Make Climate Progress, where you'll get to take a deeper dive into voting rights and the intersection with climate action and environmental justice. All right, thank you all again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.